So this is my presentation over the principles of magic, part 1, the concept of magic. First of all, we have to start here because we must be sure that we are all on the same page of what is magic as a concept. So first, you need to be able to decide what is magic within your setting. This magic is a very broad definition because it is a large group of things. Just it can be anything from mystical, just anomalies that go on within the world, to a specific subset of supernatural skills. Examples of a magic type subsets for the presentation differentiation are traditional magic settings like high fantasy worlds where magic is the standard spell casting like fireball, magic missile, all these sorts of, what we in the western world would know as magic. There's Wuxia stories where magic is the magic is the energy of heaven and earth, or it is separated as a concept, and these two are both supernatural energies that can be used within the setting. Though in many stories, magic is synonymous with like the heavenly energies, so for the West, it would be called magic. There are settings where magic is treated as a mystical and all-encompassing tropes of supernatural activities, such as like anything from Cthulhu to casting a fireball is treated as magic. This is different between having the ancient entities as a different form of energy, but it can be counted as magic depending on the setting.
So you're saying that depending on the setting, that magic can be treated as both supernatural activity and a mystical energy, like those versus ghosts and shit.
Yes. So,
Okay.
like, the thing is, magic, you need to, whenever you're making a setting, magic needs to be defined as some form of energy. Because because the thing is, magic is a very broad concept, as I mentioned. So, people have their own thoughts behind what is magic. In some cases, you can have separate types of energy, such as soul energy, spirit energy, and magic, which are all separated. Or magic is all three of them as one. It's just a sort of thing where you need to determine what is going to be called magic within your setting.
Okay. So it's the baseline just deciding on the definition at start.
Yes,
Okay.
since there's so much you can do with it that it's very crucial at the very start to figure out what is defined as magic and what are defined as other forms of abilities. Because, like, superpowers aren't defined as magic normally. That there's a difference between settings when you call something magical and something a superpower. But in some settings, superpowers may just be a different form of magic and manifestation.
I think it's important to point out that psychic powers are also a very different kind
Yes,
of
that's the
like
thing.
ability.
Psychic powers are a different ability, but they may also be counted as magic depending on the setting.
So it's not necessarily just about definition, it's about perception in the
Yes.
setting. Okay.
Of course, the setting itself will you if you're creating the setting, you will be able to determine what is using magical energy and what is using a different form of energy and such. But this is just like there is so many different things you can do because of how broad it is as a concept.
Exactly. Yeah.
Then there's settings where magic is stored in objects primarily or in locations and then used from there. Say humans themselves don't have any sort of magical energy, but they're objects or ley lines and such that have magical energy which can be channeled through specific methods. Those are also settings. There are plenty of more subsets of magic that I could possibly write down, but it's just important that you decide what you want and then you can go from there. Because if you don't decide what you want, you're just going to get a mess of crap thrown together.
Okay.
And so then, upon deciding what subset of magic you want, then you can determine exactly how the magical energy flows and is accessed by the setting. Because energy flows. Any type of energy is going to have a flow to it. Moving on from there, depending on the type of magic you decide on, there's a key methodology behind it, which is going to be formulas. Formulas are going to be anything from chants, gestures, to mathematical equations created from magic rather than real-world science. These formulas are used to create, maintain, or directly use magic. Any setting is going to have some form of formulas behind the magic.
So this is kind of like the concept of rituals or spell casting using verbal or physical gestures as
Yes,
a
a
metaphor for
formula
formula.
it's essentially a formula is just the written mathematical version of how you would activate magic, just like how we have science and other equations that are for like slopes, rope swings, etc., etc. Formulas in this case are going to be the equations for magic. That's what I mean when I say formula as a term in this lecture.
Okay.
Of course, the thing about formulas that is that they are a very abstract concept with no real-world parallel aside from mathematical formulas, but there's no actual magical formulas in the real world, so there's no way you can properly create or use them in a story. So it's going to be something that you want to keep abstract and a mystery more or less on how they work in setting, unless you go ahead and create an entire language of magic in order to use it.
Hmm.
Which is generally speaking going to be more of a pain than it's worth, so it's better to make it all seem very mystical and abstract and kind of just gloss over the details of how it works. But you can say it works, you can say you require this specific kind of formula to do something, etc., etc.
Okay.
You can still, like I said, you can still actually create them if you want, but it's not required besides some mystical looking drawings periodically.
And it's also entirely possible that you can create a system in the setting that doesn't fully grasp the potential, the actual magical system that exists in
Oh,
the overall background.
yes,
Correct?
that you can
Yeah.
do that. That's like the thing is if your setting has what one would call a language of magic, that's what it would be. The formula math is like the language of science, and in this case the formulas are the language of magic. You can have like simplified versions that people figure out and such because that's just how language works. Even if there's like the core language, there will be derivatives, there will be dialects of that language.
Hmm.
Of course, in the case that your setting has such a thing, if you have that, obviously any dialect that's closer to the origin of magical languages will be stronger than the other ones.
Okay. This kind of reminds me of the concept of the ancient language from the Aragon series,
Hmm.
where it's like correct pronunciation of it is the key to actually utilizing higher forms of magic.
Yeah, that's a way to think of it. Like how there's the dragon language, which is said to be the language of magic in a lot of stories. And if you use dragon language if you use the dragon language to cast magic, it's going to be a fuck ton stronger than the human version of magic because it's closer to the origin.
Hmm.
And aside from the formulas, each type of magic subset will have their own flow. Because magic is a form of energy, determining your flow is critical to a storytelling experience using magic. The flow of said energy can be heavily restricted, moderately usable, or people can have complete control over it. It's just what works for your setting.
Okay.
That brings us to the next part. Principles of Magic Part 2, Simplified or Structured Magic.
Okay.
Simplified or structured magic is probably the most prevalent common form of magic in media today because this is the type of magic that takes from a skill tree or has it where or is just in video games and such. This magic is also what would naturally become of magic in an advanced society as they slowly specify and develop individual spells to get the most power out of individual actions. So the key points of simplified magic are going to be it's heavily structured and restricted on the use of magic spells. It's generally going to be very quick and mana efficient, and it's always going to have a system behind why the magic is that way or how it was developed.
Okay.
Generally uses some form of incantation or spoken word to activate magic, or it can just be used instantly. These there's not going to be a lot of rituals or long type magic because this is the sort of magic that's been developed to be the way it is. So obviously it's going to be a lot more powerful and quicker to use than full on developed traditional magic.
Hmm.
This simplified magic can take forms and skills of a video game, the developed spells of a society, specific spells graced by a divine being, or spells that are fully developed and realized by a character, etc.
Okay.
This form of magic is typically very flow restrictive because the only way you can use magic is through those spells. You're not able to control magic to do very much else because magic itself is controlled through the incantation.
So in essence, simplified magic is kind of like the spell itself is a simple tool that makes it easier for you to use, but it also restricts the, for lack of a better term, creativity that you can
Yes.
that you can utilize the spell to. It
Yes,
limits the
it's like how we
abilities that
have
you could use.
a good way to look at it is like looking at electricity and power tools. You have electricity, so much power at your hands, but you can only use it through the specific tools that you have on hand.
Yeah,
So if you don't have a tools for a specific situation, you're fucked because you can't convert the electricity into any other form except for the tools you have.
exactly. Okay.
This sort of magic is generally, like I said, going to be in video games, or it's like in D&D, and it's meant to be a very clear-cut way of how a person can learn magic and get stronger. But it also has the weakness of the fact that it does, and if you're not careful with it, it doesn't feel very natural with how it developed because it feels very restrictive in magic itself.
Okay.
Moving on from there, we move to probably the broadest category of magic, traditional magic. Traditional magic is exactly as it sounds. It's the style of magic found in traditional stories and history, wizard and witches style, like, King Arthur and Merlin. This style
Sounds
is,
more like this sounds more like idealized magic or like folklorish magic kind of.
yes, this style is going to be much less restrictive on the direct use of magic compared to simplified, but still holds formulaic spellcasting as a crucial component. Key point to this is magic is going to be very free flowing, but it has to be channeled through a spell, or it just has to be channeled properly if you want to use it. People have much more direct control over magic as an energy, but will typically take longer to use it. Spells that use incantations, written formulas, and gestures are far more common to always require in order to use magic, depending on the setting. With this type, the issue with traditional magic here is it's just a very broad category because it is the middle ground behind heavily restricted magic, or not, it should be between, fuck, I messed it up, between heavily restricted and controlled magic and complete feeling-based free flow. Because, like, whenever you read a story about wizards using magic, there's always the stuff about how they have to go through proper incantations or use formulas, but they're able to actually feel the energy and control it themselves in that regards.
Okay.
So this is the type of setting where rather than having everything already predetermined on how spells work and such, this is one where it's still possible to create new magic or you can like amplify spells or weaken them by using more or less magic. You can manipulate the energy in order to change spells a bit, and it's generally speaking just a very broad setting of what you can actually do with magic itself.
So in essence, the concept of spellcasting here is less about like the restriction of creating formulas like 1 + 1 = 2 and 1 + 1 can only equal 2, where instead it's more of like an experimentation process where you can learn to do different things with the magic that other people can learn, but you can always experiment and find new things to do with it, new combinations, new
Yes,
like
whereas in structured
tweaks.
magic, it's so predetermined. It's the difference between having a fully formed sentence that is no grammatical errors to the point where you can't touch it, and having a sentence that's has a lot of room for growth. Say like I tell you, "Hey, I want to go to the bathroom," versus something along the lines of how Versus where is the bathroom?
Hmm.
With the where's the bathroom, there's still a lot of things that I could add on, like, hey, where's the bathroom in this building? Where's the bathroom in this area? Where's the bathroom that I can use? But the other one is, hey, tell me where the bathroom is. You can't really add any more or take away anything from it because it's already determined.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a good way to look at it from the formula standpoint is structured magic is down to the point of 1 plus 1 equals 2. Traditional magic is square plus triangle equals what kind of shape?
Hmm.
Because you can make a house with a square and triangle. You can put the triangle in the square and just have a square. You can make it so that way the square is on top of the triangle. There's a lot of different. You
To make a
can
ramp with the
manipulate it a
triangle
bit.
next to the square. Yeah.
Because those are all technically the right answer.
Technically, I
But
can make a boat with a triangle and a square.
yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah. So I can see what you mean. So it's like it's more manipulative to the point where you can create new things by combining, mixing, and matching different forms of magic or different formulas of the magic.
Hmm.
So it's less
But
about learning like disciplines of magic and more about just finding your own style almost.
sort of. This is the type of magic that works very well with having people that are specialized in a specific kind of magic, rather than like the skill based one is the thing of you just, once you learn the skill, you can use the magic that way. So you can kind of use any type of magic you want. This one, you'll generally find wizards that are more based around like space type magic, using fire, using water, etc., etc.,
Okay.
because they have to actually develop their abilities through continuous use and activity. At the same time, with this setting, though, this is the one where you'll find anywhere from an instant cast fireball to a long cast meteor strike. It's going to be it's right is because it's in between both of free flow and restriction. It's going to have a lot of room on what it can do with spells.
Okay.
Continuing, yeah, it's a very broad category that has a lot of content with it. Traditional magic takes parts of both simplified magic structure and free flow magic concept, as it has spells that require some form of formula, but is still very feeling based when it comes to magic itself. Traditional magic
Okay.
can slip in. It's very easy, by the way, for this to slip into either of the two types of magic, but you can still say it should be defined as its own separate system due to the broadness of its magic usage.
Okay.
Part 4, Free Flow Magic. Free flow magic is far more open ended than either of the previous two magic systems. While it does have parts of both traditional and simplified magic, its internal requirements are far smaller than both of those systems. The key points of free flow magic are: magic is an energy that is very easy to move and control. Magic can be channeled with little more than a thought. It is very easy to develop new spells and requires far less formulas to do so.
So it's even less. Okay. Okay. So it's even more freeform than traditional magic,
Yes, that
but it's
it's the free flow and simplified magic are complete opposites of the spectrums when it comes to learning magic.
this sounds like it's so free flow that it's basically like manipulating the energy of magic directly
It
rather than
is.
channeling it through a formula.
It is. That's the
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
In this type of setting, you will normally be directly manipulating the energy itself, and then because it's very feeling based, you develop your own formulas for that energy movement. Like in let's say Wuxia or Zinzania, free flow magic is the typical style where you learn a type of magic and then you can develop skills from the magic you're learning.
Hmm. Okay.
Like if you want to try and strengthen your body or whatever, you just move the energy throughout your body. Then you really want to try and strengthen your fist, you specifically will channel more energy to your fist. Eventually develop, and if you do it enough and try to learn how to make it more efficient, you'll eventually develop a specific method that goes through your body and gives more energy to the fist in order to give it a more powerful punch or other abilities, in which case you have then created your own formula that you can then write down and teach to other people on how to get that same move.
Okay. So not only is it somewhat easier to learn the formulas because you're just learning someone else's technique, but it's also easier to expand and create your own formulas off of someone else's formula simply by adding your own spin to it.
Yes. The issue
Okay.
with this style, though, is generally speaking, it's going to be the energy is very easy to move and control, but it's also less efficient because the formulas are not as refined.
Yeah, there's got to be some balance. I also would assume that it's less standardized. Like everyone is specialized into their own little niche as a result of the fact that everyone's magic is
More or
a
less.
little different.
Some
Yeah.
people that are going to be less talented obviously will just be learning techniques themselves rather than trying to adapt and make techniques theirs
Hmm.
because they're just either not, they just don't have the talent for it or they don't put enough effort into doing so. And because of all this, free flow magic is a magic system that's heavily reliant on imagination and direct usage rather than formulas and scientific development. That's not to say the formula doesn't use nor rely on formulas for key parts of its system. It's just that it just doesn't use them as much as the previous two. The formulas are not the basis, the formulas are the afterthought.
Okay.
Because if we look at simplified versus free flow, simplified magic uses the formulas in order to manipulate the magic. Free flow magic uses the magic in order to create the formulas. They're complete opposite ends of the spectrum to get to the same result. That
Hmm.
makes sense?
It does make sense. Um, I can definitely see. Personally, I don't like the idea of such an open-ended system because I like a bit more structure. But I can definitely see how it would be useful in specific instances where you want to give people absolute like creativity potential.
Mm-hmm. Of course, there are still the rules of the system itself. It's
Uh,
just that free flow magic is going to be a lot more open ended with what you want to do with magic.
okay.
Such as like in my setting, you all are restricted to your elements, so you can't
Yeah.
use any of the other elements because you don't have the energy required for it. Of course, this means it's a lot easier though for you to use the elements you are respectively good at, and since you are essentially becoming one with the element, well, it's less you're becoming one with the element and more so you are absorbing the energy directly and controlling it. It's a lot easier for you to communicate with it is a good way to put it. Communicate and work it.
Okay.
Obviously, though, it's a lot harder to make, fucking super techniques that'll just go boom, explosion, or something really strong early on, but you
Yeah.
build up a foundation and then you can slowly grow from there. It's a lot
Okay.
more methodical in its learning process rather than simplified magic, which is going to just be you learned a spell, so now you can manipulate magic in that method.
Yeah.
I will say it's my personal favorite style of magic because I really enjoy being creative with how to use spells and such.
I it definitely gives the most freedom of creativity in a setting. I will give it that. Like, yeah, I can see your first example is the Chinese fantasy stories of Wuxia for
Hmm.
freeform, free flow magic systems.
Yeah, magic in these settings is normally not actually a concept, but rather it's what they call a heaven of energy earth. This energy, though, can be synonymous with magic as a concept, so I use that as I like to call it magic for the sake of the server.
Okay.
And then when using energy, it's typically very easy to move and directly manipulate the power for its use, but at the same time, typically, but at this, I need to change that. That's using two typicallys right there really adds just like repetition. But at the same time, you will almost always require a specific method or formula to gather or use the energy in unique powerful ways. Like in these settings, you have to be very talented in a specific in order to use magic itself. Like you have to actually be able to resonate with the energy of heaven and earth, and then you will be based around a type. And then if you want to be more specific and stronger while using that element, you have to have an art that's based around that element. Of course, you
Okay.
can just absorb the energy freely, but that's going to be less efficient than having a formula or rather art in order to gather the energy, which is why in my setting everyone got basic arts and then you or everyone got arts from ranging from basic to specialized.
Okay.
of course, basic arts mean that you have a lot more ability to manipulate it, but they aren't as set in power, and so you need to grow them yourselves. Whereas in your case, you got the earth forming
Earth.
art, which was just straight up like, all right, you have a path laid out before you, and it's going to be fucking good.
Okay, so it's a lot more structured, but there's a lot less potential for immediate growth.
There's a lot less potential. Yeah, that's the thing. That's generally how it's going to be. The Wuxia slash Zanzania stories take a mixture of both, of basically all of it, but they are primarily based in free flow magic style because that's just how the energy works. Of
Okay.
course, Wuxia leans a lot more towards simplified or traditional magic, but Zanzania is the type that I went with my story as well.
Okay.
And because of how all this works, the development in free flow is going to be far more abstract in concept than traditional or simplified magic because there's no predetermined path. So you have to, in most cases anyway, you're going to have to develop a lot of your own abilities or path, even if you get some of them handed to you.
Okay.
Because of this,
Kaiser, how are you doing with this? Is he
he's
here?
dead.
Yeah,
So
he's there.
because of this, in free
I'm here.
flow, it is
Okay.
much easier to directly use magic and they are able to create new arts and other forms of magic with greater ease due to inspiration or testing being a lot and it's being a lot less mathematically intensive because it's a lot more feeling based. That's not to
Yeah,
say
it's a
that
lot more
all
about technique and personal like training than it is about knowledge.
yes.
Yeah.
Of course, there's still the knowledge-based style that people can go for, but it's just the more mainstream method in free flow is a lot more feeling and technique.
Okay.
That's not to say all Wuxias and Zadia use this style directly. Many use systems that are a mix between free flow and traditional, specifically when making and using magical abilities. For higher level magical abilities, even in the Zinzania style, you're not able to just directly manipulate the energy and go boom. It takes time to like build up. There's a specific method you have to follow. You may have to chant, do gestures, or write something down, or use objects or people as sacrifices. It's that kind of thing. There's always going to be those types of elements in every story. It's just that the primary basis of these stories is in free flow. And now, Principles of Magic Part 5: Other Forms and Uses.
Okay.
So far, all forms of magic discussed have been systems of magic directly used by a person, but not every system requires this. Some systems may make magic require objects like crystals or staffs that heavily restrict magic usage without them, but are still under the free flow category because the objects themselves are just a prerequisite. This can also change to become a simplified or traditional by removing by adding restrictions to the magic usage even when you have the crystals and staffs.
Yeah, this is like the channeling concept, where in order to most efficiently utilize your magic, you need some form of a median to channel the energy
Yeah,
into
there's
yourself.
some things like that. Or like I was saying here, you literally require the objects or you can't use magic. Like,
Yeah.
there's so much freedom with what you can do. This is just a single example that you can twist in a dozen different ways. Others may take a summoner style approach where all magic is used by creatures contracted and controlled by summoners. Maybe magic is granted by the gods, and the only way to get skills is to do tasks for the gods, and the power then falls under a simplified magic system, but you can still manipulate the energy like in free flow or traditional settings. There are countless forms of magic, and I've only discussed what I consider to be the three biggest broad categories, and even then there's still plenty of systems that will have overlap between these three or completely reject all three.
Hmm.
And that's pretty much the lecture there. Any questions or ideas that you want to discuss?
Damn, I thought it was longer than that.
This
Yeah, I
is
got a couple.
like I said, this is the very much so what I wrote down and condensed.
The condensed version. Yeah.
Because I could go on for hours on each of these on coming up with ideas for each of these systems.
Okay. I have a couple of points, but I'd like to give Kaiser a chance to make some if he's got.
If I'm honest with you, this is definitely a you and reader discussion. I don't really know much about anything, so
I mean, I was just kind of glad you stayed in because it gives you some perspective on like magic systems for setting construction.
Like, I am
Yeah.
very in depth when it comes to magic systems.
Yeah, Reader
I
is the
am
magic
fucking
guy.
crazy about them. I'm not very good with all the guns and technical stuff because I've never been a huge fan of sci-fi. It's cool, but I've never been really into learning about it.
Yeah. The I guess that's kind of like where the whole melding of the two comes from, which is why I like the concept of magic tech so much,
Mhm.
since it's an underdone concept.
Yeah,
Because
It is
I guess
very
like
good.
Magic Tech's another good one. It's not under simplified traditional or free flow because of the fact that it uses technology
Yeah.
and magic itself. Even
Well, the
if both of them could be
concept-
considered a science, they're separated due to the fact one of them is a different type of energy from typical electricity form.
yeah, but the concept at base can be applied to like the way it's a very flexible concept because it can technically be applied to any of the three magic systems that you've described.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I tend to apply it in a more simplified magic system where you take the existing formulas of magic and you substitute them for higher functioning forms of technology in existing devices to create hybrid devices that are capable of doing more than what would be able to do separate. For example, like you combine the power of the ability of a sending stone to send messages long distance, but it's limited in its range and like the length of the messages by the power that you're able to channel into it. You substitute your own power by hooking it up to a like mana battery or a makeshift electrical system that uses
Jack, you're
energy.
scratching on your mic.
Sorry, I'm scratching the side of my computer again. I always do this by accident. But if you substitute in your own mana in the sending crystal with, say, a hybrid electric battery or a separate setup of like a mana reservoir that you create using technology, now you have the equivalent of a long range radio transceiver that uses magic. It's the same with
Mm-hmm.
like guns. Instead of using, gunpowder, you just create the frame of a weapon and then you substitute in like fire magic or explosive magic, or you use like literally just uh kinetic. What the closest thing I could think of is like kinetic magic, like propellant
Kinetic
magic.
energy.
Yeah, like a magic form, sort of like you force pull, force push in Star Wars, like a
Mm-hmm.
form of magic that allows you to propel objects, and then you just now you've basically got the equivalent of, depending on how much energy you put into the spell, you've got the equivalent of either a crossbow, a rifle, or even like a rail gun, depending on how
Mm-hmm.
much force you put behind that spell. Because it's all just kinetic energy at the end of the day when you get down
Yeah,
to it. It's
that's
just
definitely
different varying levels.
Yeah, that's a thing. That is a method of doing it as well. I think that's a very cool idea because that allows for a broader approach of magic and technology as a whole. But at the same time, like torn between that and then having technology versus magic due to the fact that they are very hard to mix or almost incompatible with one another due to the systems of energy being so different from one another. Both of those are great story devices and great plot devices, but I'm torn between them myself, and I personally am better with magic as well, so I never have delved into mixing too much.
No, I agree. Like, I love the idea of magic versus technology as a thematic backdrop for settings. And you're right, it does make a lot of sense considering both come from
Yeah.
disparately different, like, formulaic systems, science versus what is effectively esoteric knowledge.
Yeah, the thing is as
And
well though there with like magic and electricity, they're both forms of energy, but it's like comparing, let's say like it's the thing is it's like having electricity is a form of energy and such, but then magic as well. There's no like good comparison I can think of
I
except like
think
saying
I
like
think the better
except like
hold
saying
on.
one of them's water and one of them's oil.
I think the better way that I think of it is that, because I don't consider just electrically powered technology to be a comparison to magic. I consider all forms of technology.
Yeah,
So the way I think of it is
I know, but I'm
ethereal
just thinking
forms of
like every
energy, like magic, versus physical forms of energy, like oil, steam,
yeah.
electricity. Yeah.
Though the thing is like I say electricity because that's what I consider the base form of power to be in technology because that's, more or less the start. Everything can be converted into some level of electricity.
Fair.
So
Fair.
that's just how I compare it. And then I see electricity and magic both as a flow, as I've mentioned. When I say flow, I don't directly mean like a liquid, but there is a movement within them similar to liquids. So I like to see them not like just two like to see them as two different types of liquids in that regards, like water and oil. That's not to say
Mhm.
they have the same properties as water and oil. I just mean to say they're two different types that may not be compatible with one another, but they can be compatible with one another. So it just adds a lot of depth and potentiality to a story when comparing magic and technology, which is similar to how I see magic itself. Because in my setting, magic is very free forming and very much so manipulatable, but at the same time, there are hard distinctions between different elements, meaning it's very difficult for them to directly mix with one another. That's similar to how technology and magic can be. But at the same time, in certain settings, you're able to just mix all different types of magic because they're the same core energy or because they just mix well with one another. You can do so much with
You
manipulating
cut out
how
there.
it
Are you
is.
good?
Oh, I'm sorry. You can just do well,
Yeah, I cut out for there for a second.
how much? I'll just start over a bit. I was
No,
say,
no, don't start over. It was just like for a quick second. I
all right
just like
then.
missed a word.
But so then but then when it comes to magic in that regards, it all depends on the setting that you want because magic is such a or is such a unique concept. It has so many different things that could work because we have never discovered magic itself. With technology, we at least have a basis, but even then, we have done scientific research into what could be potentially possible, and the high science is very similar or is very similar in regards to our imagination as magic itself. So it creates a great balance between the two of them, as well as a great comparison. But if you look at how technology has developed in those stories and how magic has developed in stories,
Hmm.
it
No, I agree with that. Yeah, I think you're right. At the end of the day, though, it comes down to your own personal preference and what you're good at. And
yeah, and it come
like you said, you much prefer magic, and like you're much
yeah,
better
no,
at
there's
developing
nothing wrong with
magic
any of that.
systems.
I'm just saying more so as a comparison, like, there's so much you can do with both of them. What matters is the setting itself, and from there, you can develop the magic or technology. Personally
Yeah,
speaking,
and
like
how
I
you
said, I go with
utilize
magic because I know more about magic, but that's not to say technology can't be just as creative or informative.
I'll admit that it's almost easier to work with magic because magic is a lot more freeform than technology. Because if you work with like sci-fi levels of technology, you either need to hand wave everything, or
Hmm.
you need to come up with some like
System.
Trekkie style like sci-fi mumbo jumbo to explain everything.
Yeah, the with magic as well. If you really want to make a good system, you can't just hand wave it. You have to actually like come up with some form of rules and a system behind how magic works, which is like in my setting. At the very I like to do it where essentially Chinese is the language of magic, which is why that's what's used in formulas and creation of pretty much everything that is magical. That's not to say like
Mhm.
that's not to say that's the only method you could do it or the method you should do it. That's what I like to do, and as such, I have a lot of rules and systems behind how my system works. It's
Mhm.
much more free flow than a direct here is how you learn magic. There's still rules behind how you do it. It's just these rules are more so like the laws of the universe, like the laws of physics but applied to magic.
Okay. And it works a lot more thematically too, having the language be Chinese when you consider the source material of the Wuxia and the Xianian stories.
Xianxia, whatever.
Xianzi, is it Xianzin or
Uh, I'm not
Xianzia?
actually exactly sure how to pronounce it,
I mean, you
cause
pronounce the X's as Z's, so I think it was Xianzia
yeah,
or
that's
Xian.
what I was thinking.
Yeah,
Xianxia. But yeah, so
yeah.
that's a lot of the base. That's pretty much the basics covered for how magic works. At least with the amount of time that I've spent, this is what I have found to be like the three core methods that people like to do magic in.
I will say that as like a baseline, that does seem to be the case because D&D is definitely simplified magic, but
Mhm.
then systems like, for example, what is seen in, I would almost say like, um, not Traveler. It's called Pathfinder. Pathfinder uses a bit more of a traditional system, if I'm remembering correctly. but I've not seen freeform or free flow in a lot of settings. I've seen it in settings. I haven't seen it in systems before.
Yes,
A
because
lot.
free flow is very difficult to do on a system level, it's much easier to do from a narrative level.
Yeah.
Exactly because of the fact there's no concrete way to do it or concrete way to grow stronger because the system is not made to be concrete. It's a system that's made to be very open-ended and allow for a lot of creativity. Still though, like I really love Magic as a whole, and I really do enjoy the concepts behind it and the potentialities, such as the conversation we had last night where I described to you one of the many potential systems for doing divine beings.
Yeah.
If you get me on a topic for something, I can go a lot more in depth on how I can see it be done because of the fact I know I already have thought through and know the rules behind how those systems should work from a both physics, quote unquote, because it's essentially the laws of magic level, as well as from a story perspective.
Yeah, and like I said last night, I'd love to like I agree with pretty much everything you said in terms of like the baseline for concept deities and
Hmm.
stuff like that. The only problem is, like you said, we need to actually determine a baseline for the magic system we're using before we can decide on any concrete ideas of what we want the deities to be.
Yeah, and
And like I don't even know if
that's
we want I
yeah.
don't even know if we even want sentient deities or like
If
do we
you
want
even want
just pure
deities
concept
themselves.
deities? I think we definitely want deities. I don't know if we want like deities that can conscientiously affect their will on
Yeah,
the
but that's
world.
the thing though. You can still have deities without actually having them because you can have people worship things that don't actually exist, etc.
Of course. Yeah,
It
yeah.
may not be a god, but they could worship some form of power, and their quote unquote worshiping is just a way of channeling the power itself. That's another
The
method of
question is
doing
whether we
stuff.
want yeah, the question is whether we want the worship to directly correlate to a power or to be based around a power or whether we want it to just be based around concepts like how you brought up where it's like what if we just want them to be worshiping the sun or the moon or like the
Yeah.
tides and stuff because that's where magic is derived from if we're going with that system.
Yeah, it's just it really depends on what you decide for your setting because of how open-ended it is. I can come up with ideas out the fucking wazoo for different sort of methods. It's just you have to settle down on something at some point before you can properly develop it, which is kind of the
Yeah.
sad thing about Magic because it's so open-ended and so free. It's you have so much potential, but you can't do all the potential you want because you have to eventually put down rules, otherwise things just start to go out of control.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if that's about it, that should pretty much wrap up the magic lecture, unless you have like anything you want to delve into.
Okay. Um I'm not really in the mood to go into lots of minutia right now.
Mm-hmm.
Normally I would, but I'm kind of tired from walking all the way back from the mall.
No, you're fine. All
So
good.
mostly I'm kind of good on covering the fundamentals. And like this is a very like even though you condensed it, this is a very comprehensive like cover of the fundamentals and like the baseline categories that you can fit different magical systems into.
Mm-hmm. It's it's like it was just I spent an hour today typing this all up and getting it ready specifically so I could do this. Unfortunately, presentations are always going to be shorter than that what you want them to be, or it feels like in this
Well, like you
regard.
said, you could have talked a lot more about this, but you took
Yeah,
what you had as the fundamental concepts and you put it into one exam into one
mm-hmm.
lecture rather than yeah, which I'm
Yeah,
fine with.
cause like
I like short and sweet rather than just like long
one of the
drawn out
things as well is
conversations all the
the
time.
first thing that comes to my mind is generally going to be very open-ended magic systems. But I had glanced through your project ideas discussion where you had put down the text document that talked about in their magic there was the artifice magic. That's where I remembered. Oh right, that type of magic exists, and that's why I wrote down the object style magic system where you require something as a prerequisite before you can use magic.
Okay.
Because I don't normally think of that personally since I'm very open ended in my thoughts, but that is something that exists. There's the style of magic like the ley lines magic where you have it at a location and you will require that in order to use magic because people themselves are not magically inclined. There's so many different things. Then like I saw the solderized magic power, which is another thing as well. But in some settings, like in Wuxia style, soul energy is quite literally a different style of energy and is another
Mhm.
form of what would be considered magic, but it is not but it is not the energy of the heaven and earth. Then there's spirit energy, which is another style of energy, and so forth and so forth. There's so many different things that you can do with magic that it's just like I can't write them all down
Exactly.
because I can just think of so many, and it's so much fun. It's so much fun to brainstorm these sort of ideas, but it's so hard to make them concrete because of the fact it's so much fun.
At some point, I need to do something like this lecture for the Megaverse because I need a way to condense down the information for
I
everyone to
I'll
give
tell
people
you
a
right
fine
now, I unless you pay me, I'm not bothering to do it for you. Like fuck
Oh,
that
I'll do
shit.
it myself. I'll do it
The
myself.
entire story of the Megaverse condensed into like an
No, no,
hour.
not the entire story. You'd never be able to do that. It would have to be the fundamental overviews, like short history, the factions, what's going on. That's about it. And that could be covered easily in like 12 slides. But if I'd like, I would have to skip over a bunch of details and stuff, but these don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. If all you want to know is who are the major players, what are they doing with one another, why are they doing these things?
Mhm.
That's not actually that complicated.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording here then. That's 45
All right.
minutes.